make a premise before getting into the talk. So the talk is divided into two parts. The first is taken from an article that I'm currently revising, which deals with the characterization of 18th century French Cartesianism by focusing on the neglected figure of Noël Regnault. And the second part is about Du Châtelet. I raised some questions about where she stands with respect to this Cartesian tradition, and this is not part of any published paper or in publication. So a few words of introduction about the historiographical issues that I address, especially in the first part of the talk, and also about Regnault, whom I assume most of you do not know. So many Enlightenment authors and positivist commentators in the 19th century after them, and also 20th century historians, have insisted on the radical separation between the Newtonians and the Cartesians, and portrayed their opposition in terms of enlightened science vis-a-vis ignorance and prejudice. In the last decades, as you know, many scholars have been unraveling this narrative, showing, for instance, and this is just one example among the many, that the rigid separation between the two factions does not faithfully represent the positions in the debate, which were often the results of assimilations and contaminations between Cartesianism and Newtonianism. Despite this and other important developments in the scholarship, substantial critical work still needs to be done on broader questions that concern the historiographical uses of the categories Cartesian and Newtonian, and thus also Cartesianism and Newtonianism. Most commentators have hardly engaged in serious reflection on these categories, leaving it somewhat indeterminate what Cartesianism and Newtonianism actually refer to, and which criteria should be adopted to classify an author in either of these groups. One solution that has been adopted and quite widely to avoid the problem is to underscore that these categories of Cartesianism and Newtonianism are portmanteau terms, which refer to meanings and authors too varied to be incorporated into a single definition. I disagree with this approach for some reasons. The main one is the following, namely that the historical documents seem to highlight an important convergence of authors that were considered back then, or that we might consider Cartesian and Newtonian, around certain ideas and methods. So now I will narrow my focus on Cartesianism. And I will point out that historians have identified at least two general ideas that were common to most 18th century French Cartesians, which highlight, by the way, a tight connection with the work of the historical Descartes. First, the belief in what Lisa Downing has labeled strict mechanism, namely the idea that interactions between bodies can only happen by mutual contact, which entailed, among other things, the so-called vortex theory of planetary motions. Second, the idea that to demonstrate in physics does not involve mathematics, but rather the reference to causal mechanical models based on matter and motion. These two features, however, are compatible with the classical traditional reading of 18th century French Cartesianism, as I said, derived from its Enlightenment critics, according to which these Cartesians would be merely rationalist and dogmatic philosophers. So in this paper and then first part of this talk, I argue that there were at least two other elements that need to be considered and that also contribute to undermine the picture of an anti-modern Cartesianism by which historiography is still influenced to some extent. And the first, which I will not treat in detail today, is an emphasis on experimentalism, namely the view that experience and experiments are crucial to natural philosophical practice. Experimentalism emerges clearly from an analysis of the teaching practice of Cartesians and of texts, such as Regnault's ones, as we'll see, addressed to a non-expert readership, such as handbooks or dialogues. Now, this not only contradicts the received picture of the Cartesian tradition as merely rationalist, but also suggests a continuity with 17th century Cartesianism, and I thank Aaron for this, as well as other suggestions, where experimental practice played a significant role. And one might think, for instance, of Jacques Roux and Roux's endeavor to disseminate Descartes' natural philosophy by relying on experimental trials. However, the experimentalism of 18th century French Cartesians also relied on other sources than the very Cartesian tradition, namely, and these are the two main other sources, experimental research conducted in scientific academies, and for French Cartesians, obviously, the Paris Academy of Sciences, and also Newton's own experimental practice. Also, these Cartesians discussed experiments and observations not only to prove specific natural philosophical theses, as it was often the case with 17th century Cartesians, but also to provide the readership with useful knowledge about various natural phenomena, including chemical phenomena and optical phenomena, thus proving a certain acquaintance with the dimension of practice. We sometimes mention laboratory activities and so on. So I will stop here about talking about experimentalism, and I will be mainly focused on the second feature of 18th century French Cartesianism, which is an epistemological thesis that I call conjecturalism or probabilism. But before delving into it, I'd like to say a few words about Regnault. So Noël Regnault was a Jesuit. He took up the mathematics professorship at the Jesuit College Louis le Grand in Paris in 1732 and occupied the chair for 2 decades until 52. The list of his published works is quite long. The main one, also for its circulation, is the Entretien physique d'Ariste et d'Eudoxe, or Physique nouvelle en dialogue, or physical conversations of Ariste and Eudoxe, or New Physics in Dialogues, published in 3 tomes in 1729, which went through several editions, 7 until 1745, and then other posthumous editions. This Entretien circulated widely in Europe at the time, were translated into English, Italian, Dutch. And Regnault also published 2 other series of conversations, the ones on logic, which were also translated into several languages, and the 3rd series on mathematics. The second text, apart from the Entretien physique, on which I will concentrate, is a critique of Voltaire's Elements of the Philosophy of Newton, which was also published in 1738, on which I will come back later on. Regnault's philosophical approach has been described by the few commentators who have focused on his work as Aristotelian or Cartesian. And in fact, for him, Aristotelianism and Cartesianism were not opposed, but rather complementary perspectives. Modern knowledge, in Regnault's view, builds on the ancient, but also brings the intuitions of the ancient authors, such as Aristotle, to a higher degree of perfection. And of course, the champion of this modernization of natural philosophy is Descartes. And one should notice about, and I will probably come back on this later on in the talk, that Regnault's Aristotelianism is different from the 17th century Cartesians' combination of Aristotle and Descartes, the one we find in Roux, for instance. In the 18th century, especially in the Jesuit tradition, which was still very much influenced by the Aristotelian perspective, the reference to Aristotle in natural philosophical context, and I borrow J.B. Shank's expression, is phrasing of the thing, amounted to a rejection of abstruse mathematical thought in favor of common sense empiricism. So recalling of the centrality of experience and common sense in natural philosophy. So that being said about Regnault, I'd like to consider this conjecturalism of which I've mentioned earlier on, through Regnault's works. And in the paper, I also make several parallels with other Cartesians, Jean-Simon Mazières, Joseph Privat de Molière, and so on. But I will not have the time to make these parallels here today. And the starting point will be the fifth conversation of the first tome of the Entretien Physique, which follows the debate in the fourth Entretien on the porosity of bodies. And in this fifth conversation, the one interlocutor, Eudox, who is a mature man with a wide knowledge of science, discusses the existence of vacuum, one of the main topics in natural philosophy back then, especially in Cartesian natural philosophy, with the other interlocutor, Ariste, a young philosopher, unexperienced in natural philosophy, but willing to learn as much as possible. Ariste, so the young philosopher, starts by defining the notion of vacuum. A vacuum is properly a surface capable of containing a body which contains, however, anyone at all. From a logical point of view, Ariste continues, the idea of vacuum is not contradictory, therefore its existence in nature is possible. And I quote, whatever implies no contradiction is possible. A vacuum implies no contradiction, for what contradiction is there in a surface proper for containing a body and which yet contains none at all? These terms no way destroy one another, therefore a vacuum is possible. On this point, what's interesting to remark is that the Ariste disagrees openly with Descartes. So in a famous letter, but that's only one of the main loci one could quote, in a letter to Henry Moore of February the 5th, 1649, Descartes stated that vacuum is, in fact, a contradictory concept whose existence in nature cannot be clearly conceived by reason. And the distance from the historical Descartes is underscored by Eudox when he tells Ariste that neither Mr. Descartes nor Roux nor Gis, two of the most celebrated Cartesians, were of your opinion. As I will stress later on, there is a certain affinity on the issue of conjecturalism with Roux and Regis, so with the early Cartesian tradition. But anyway, once the logical possibility of vacuum has been demonstrated in the dialogue, it remains to be assessed whether vacuum really exists or not. And the proof, which I cannot discuss in detail here because it would be too long, but I do it in the paper if you're interested, is based on the interpretation of an experiment, which is the eolipile. In fact, the experiment is not really that of Hero's eolipile, but rather the so-called Eros fountain. But anyway, the idea is similar. The issue of the experiment, the stake is to explain how dilatation can happen, dilatation of air in particular, if one doesn't assume that when the particle of a substance are separated, removed from one another, they leave interstices that are void, that contain vacuum. And the idea of Eudox and thus of Regnault is that such interstices are not void, but filled with subtle matter, whose existence had been demonstrated in a previous conversation. More generally, the point of this experiment and of the explanation is to show that the possibility of a mechanical explanation of phenomena makes the reference to vacuum unnecessary. Not only is this notion less clear than mechanical concepts, although both are possible and legitimate, but it is also dispensable. And since the phenomena can be explained in terms of mechanical terms. And if it's dispensable, it should be put aside, should not be used. But apart from this, let's say, classical mechanical interpretation or demonstration of the inexistence of vacuum, the most original aspect of Regnault's discussion lies in the anti-Cartesian premise of the argument, which ends up grounding a Cartesian conclusion without presenting this conclusion as an a priori truth or as a logical deduction. So the proof is delegated to experience in a certain way. The acknowledgement of the possibility on a merely conjectural plan, of course, of a thesis which is ultimately to be disproved is a typical trait of Regnault's methodology, as well as of those other, of several other contemporary Cartesians. And this approach, this conjecturalist approach, can also, and probably better, be seen at work, also in the discussion of gravitation, of universal attraction, a topic that brings us closer to the heart of the controversy with the Newtonians. And to explore the topic of universal attraction, I will turn to the letter on Voltaire's Elements. And in this letter, in the final chapter, Regnault concedes that the idea of a universal gravitation is not contradictory, since the way in which bodies act upon one another is obscure to our limited intellects. And I quote, I would go as far as to say that a philosophical mind would not be shocked by the terms of attraction and gravitation. The term of impulsion appears to be clearer just because we are accustomed to it. God's resolutions concerning the material world are beyond our grasp. Therefore, human beings cannot possibly state with enough certainty that universal attraction is impossible. Regnault criticizes Voltaire, the Voltaire of the Elements, for his dogmatic presentation of the Newtonian system. Voltaire does not introduce attraction as a hypothesis which satisfies phenomenal evidence. He rather wants to imply, according to Regnault, that gravitation belongs to the inner nature of things from the fact that phenomena seem to prove it. And this, for Regnault, is a non sequitur. And he writes, the laws of gravitation explain the movements of the celestial bodies. Gravitation, therefore, is a force existing in reality. The system of gravitation, therefore, is the true system of nature. I do not see how this can be the case. This conclusion is in fact fallacious. At most, one could conclude that gravitation is an ingenious hypothesis, a possible principle. In Regnault's view, the main argument brought by Voltaire in support of attraction is in fact the argument from authority. And in arguing so, Regnault flipped over one of the main accusations that were traditionally formulated against the Cartesians, namely to hold on to their beliefs only because faithful to Descartes' authority. But Regnault's point is even more radical than that. His point is that one ought to be skeptical about the very possibility of knowing the true system of the world. There is a quotation, it seems to be impossible for humans to know the true system of nature. We see different systems explaining the same phenomena with the same ease. Which is the true one? This we cannot state with any certainty. Voltaire had the presumption of proposing the ultimate truth on the nature of things, thus showcasing his charlatanism. Regnault thus opposes the figure of the false philosopher, whose model is, of course, Voltaire, to that of the true philosopher. The true philosopher doubts when he has to, does not claim to have demonstrated when he has not, and knows how to evaluate the proofs. A true philosopher is thus an open-minded experimenter who formulates hypotheses based on the regularities observed in nature. More generally, physics does not seek absolute truth, but rather aims at likelihood. A true philosopher, according to Regnault, and this is a particularly important passage, would give preference to mechanical over attractionist physics. And I quote, it is sure that among the hypotheses, that of the insensible resistance of ethereal matter will be more appreciated by the majority of philosophers than that of an unintelligible attraction. If one supposes this ethereal matter to be composed of small vortices that stand in perfect equilibrium, the mind clearly understands the likelihood of the insensible resistance of ethereal matter. Consider attraction under any possible aspect, the mind will always see in it nothing else than mystery, darkness, and unintelligibility. So Regnault invokes a consensus of philosophers based on a sort of immediate evidence to the mind of the intelligibility of attraction. It is an argument that refers to the pragmatic common sense empiricism, as I said, typical of his Aristotelianism. The human mind understands mechanical principles better than attraction, because it continuously experiences body-body interactions where motion is transferred from one body to another by mutual contact. By contrast, the mind does not understand a force that acts at a distance mysteriously, although it cannot absolutely rule out its possibility. There seems to be an unresolved tension, if not a contradiction, in this crucial step of Regnault's argument. He seems to rely on the philosopher's consensus, on the habit of considering mechanism as more intelligible than attraction, all that he had previously denounced as insufficient to establish natural philosophical preferences. So I quote again the same passage: the term of impulsion appears to be clearer just because we are accustomed to it. The ordinary knowledge and common sense seem ultimately to be the only real reason for discarding attraction. Also, Regnault seems to contradict in a certain way its epistemic principles, namely the openness to alternatives to mechanism, when he declares attraction unintelligible, and he does so twice in the passage that I've quoted above. Attraction should not be unintelligible based on his own premises. And again, thank Aaron for the suggestion. Let's go back to conjecturalism. So conjecturalism was not only an original expression of epistemic modesty, but should also and especially be read as a strategy to readapt the mechanical paradigm to preserve it from the fierce advance of attractionist physics. And one can here see a difference between Regnault and the first Cartesians, the 17th century Cartesians, such as Ruth and Régis, who were also conjecturalists to a certain extent. For instance, in the Système de Philosophie, Pierre-Sylvain Régis, we are in 1690, Régis argues that speculative physics, what he calls speculative physics, namely the discipline concerned with the causes of particular phenomena, can provide results both only in a problematic manner, and nothing that is demonstrated pertains to it. However, Régis, as Schmalz has shown, and I quote Schmalz's words, is committed to holding that physics is founded on truths that are neither merely probable nor in need of empirical confirmation. Regnault and other 18th century French Cartesians radicalize the method of hypothesis already present in the Cartesian tradition towards a more general conjecturalism, according to which all propositions in natural philosophy are merely probable, and Regnault states that quite explicitly, and no certainty can be attained on the ultimate nature of things, or at least it should be so based on their premises. Yet, Regnault does so by way of reaction against what he considers to be the new dogmatism of the Newtonians, and particularly Voltaire. It is, in other words, and maybe this phrasing is not the best one, but I liked it, and so I use it, a strategy that combines the apparently opposite ideas of radicalization and conservation, sort of a paradoxical form of conservative radicalism, and not radical conservatism, but it could be both in principle. So this is what I had to say about the Cartesians and particularly Regnault. And I now move on to the second part of my talk, which is focused on Du Châtelet. And the question, I don't know if it's a pertinent question, but you will tell me, from which I started to reflect, is where does Du Châtelet stand with respect to this tradition, this epistemology? And perhaps a preliminary and more historical question is, why do I even discuss her position in this context? Well, it is because Du Châtelet published a review of Voltaire's Elements of the Philosophy of Newton in the Journal des Savants in September 1738. So in 38, the elements were published, and also Du Châtelet's review, and also Regnault's letter. So the letter, Regnault's letter, and this review can be considered as the immediate controversial context of Voltaire's text. And in this review, after presenting Voltaire's discussion of the Newtonian theory of light and colors, Du Châtelet comes at a certain point to the question of gravitational attraction. And she underscores the strategic importance of this point by observing what follows. It is especially while developing the system of the world and the causes of gravity and the falling of bodies that Voltaire attacks Cartesianism. In particular, Du Châtelet seemed to argue for the impossibility of reducing attraction to purely mechanical causes. The attempts that several philosophers had done to reduce attraction to impulsion relied on the fact that Mr. Newton, as she writes, have never provided the cause of attraction. One of the passages quoted by most philosophers to legitimate the attempt to mechanize attraction is Samuel Clarke's famous reply to Leibniz. I think it's the fifth reply, but I might be wrong. But anyway, philosophers may search after and discover that cause of gravity if they can, be it mechanical or not mechanical. If this Leibniz or any other learned author can, by the law of mechanism, explain this phenomena, he will not only not be contradicted, but will moreover have the abundant thanks of the learned world. Well, Du Châtelet thinks that to justify the mechanical deduction of attraction based on this passage of Clarke's reply is unfair. And she writes that if one reads Clarke's reply in full, it is easy to see from what comes before and after those words that Clarke is being ironical. Newton has clearly shown the impossibility of translating attraction into the vocabulary of mechanism, and Du Châtelet writes, it is the real Newton speaking there in the General Scholium. Du Châtelet goes as far as to ridicule the very project, the very idea of providing a mechanical cause for gravitation. To provide a mechanical cause for gravitation, quote, would be the same thing as to search for the mechanical cause of impenetrability or inertia. Referring once again implicitly to the General Scholium, Du Châtelet stresses that the cause of attraction will always be with God, namely in his will, through which this almighty being had chosen to give to matter the attractive force, as well as mobility, impenetrability, etc. Thus, attraction seems to be on a par with other intrinsic properties of matter, mobility, impenetrability. And, well, this seemingly orthodox Newtonian perspective of the 1738 review of Voltaire's book is turned into a much more critical approach in the Foundations of Physics of 1740, only 2 years after. And as you all know, in chapter 16, and I'm not an expert on Du Châtelet, so I try, you will forgive me if I say something, well, inaccurate, but you will correct me during the Q&A, hopefully. In chapter 16 of Newtonian attraction, Du Châtelet explains that when Newton presents attraction on a macroscopic scale, the planetary motions, and the Principia in particular, it takes it to be a factual law inducted from phenomenal regularities, whose deepest cause we do not know and perhaps will never know. However, when attraction is discussed as an active principle, which functions at the microscopic level, for instance, the final queries of the optics, the philosophical status of gravitation changes. Since every material particle is guided in its operations by the active principle of attraction, attraction must be an immanent principle of activity, and many Newtonians have considered it as such. That is, attraction must be the ultimate cause of all natural phenomena. And Du Châtelet considers the application of attraction to any kind of phenomenon, especially at the microscopic level, misleading. And while discussing in the same chapter Maupertuis's Newtonian piece on the laws of attraction, published in 1732 in the Mémoires de l'Académie des Sciences, where Maupertuis had discussed the possible reasons for God's preference for the inverse square law of gravitation over all other possible equations, Du Châtelet writes the following. If this philosopher, Maupertuis, before inquiring into the reason for the preference of one law of attraction over another, had inquired into the sufficient reason for attraction itself, it is likely that he would soon have recognized that this attraction, as it is propounded by the Newtonians, that is to say, insofar as we make it a property of matter and the cause of the majority of phenomena, is inadmissible. And to support the claim that attraction cannot be an intrinsic property of matter and the cause of all natural phenomena for theory, because it lacks a sufficient reason, Du Châtelet offers the following argument that I reconstructed, but I will propose you in a more discursive way. So imagine that a body, A, which is presently at rest, is suddenly attracted towards another body, B, and the space between these two bodies is completely void. A, starting to move towards B, changes its initial state. And this change, on the basis of the principle of sufficient reason, must have some reason. The reason for such a change of state is therefore to be found either in the body which is moved, A, or outside of this body A. The reason cannot lie within the body A, because before being attracted, it was not moving, and bodies are naturally indifferent to motion and rest. But the reason cannot be outside of it either. The space that separates the two bodies is void, and B does not send out any fluid or subtle matter that might account for A's change of state. Therefore, this change in a purely Newtonian orthodox framework lacks a sufficient reason. Now, Du Châtelet writes, we can say that in the system of attraction, not even God could resolve this problem. For all the determinations of the body remaining perfectly the same, and no alteration being able to occur from the outside, it is absolutely impossible, even for God, with a unique basis of prediction being removed, to say if this body has to move or not, and what law it will follow in its motion. In Christian Wolff's terms, attraction is a casus purus, actualitas sive existentia destituta ratione sufficiente, an actuality or existence deprived of sufficient reason. And what's interesting to remark in the General Cosmology of 1731 is that the explanation of what a casus purus is quite similar to Du Châtelet's argument about the bodies A and B. I just have a short quotation from Wolff this time. And Wolff writes, that's my translation probably, but if we posit that A is modified by B, such that A exists under the form B, or B can be predicated of A, and the reason for this modification is neither intrinsic to A itself, nor can be found in an extrinsic reason C, because because B is predicated or exists in A rather than not. Potius incit quam non incit. I didn't know how to translate incit in good English, but anyway, then the existence or the actuality of B is a pure case, sheer indeterminacy, a casus purus. So I see some analogies between this argument and then Du Châtelet's approach, but anyway, attraction, coming back to Du Châtelet, cannot therefore be taken as the cause of any physical process. It should then be the effect of some other cause. And quite surprisingly for a reader of the 1738 review, at least, Du Châtelet claims that the cause of attraction should be sought in the laws of mechanism. And I read a quotation, since all that is must have a sufficient reason for why it is as it is, rather than otherwise, the direction and the speed impressed by attraction must therefore find their sufficient reason in an external cause, in some matter that collides with the body that we regard as called attiré, attracted. Thus, we must seek by means of the laws of mechanics some matter capable of producing by its motion the effects that we attribute to attraction. And the passage continues. Du Châtelet, at least from this passage, seems now to argue that attraction must be translated, or at least translatable, into mechanical terms in order to be physically meaningful. On what grounds does she argue this? And the other question that I ask myself is, how is her understanding of physics different from that of Voltaire on the one hand and of the Cartesians on the other hand? Cartesians who also pleaded for a mechanical reduction of attraction. And so I borrow a suggestion from a paper recently published by Aaron. So sorry for quoting you, but I felt very much in agreement with what you say in this passage, so I'd like to quote it. So Aaron provides a useful suggestion to make sense of this need for a mechanical reduction of attraction. Du Châtelet defends what she calls general or physical explanations. Du Châtelet distinguishes between the general physical explanation of phenomena and engagement in detail with the phenomena and their mechanical causes. So these two levels, if you want attraction, then the mechanical causes. General explanations are at best incomplete and may rely on strictly false assumptions, but they do pick out general features of a force, such as the force of attraction, even if the cause of this tendency of attraction is not thereby explained in mechanistic terms. Although Du Châtelet takes mechanistic explanation as an ultimate goal of inquiry, her account does not thereby undercut all non-mechanistic characterizations of force, which would explain this double-faced attitude, if you want. But some questions, I think, also remain open. And the first one, based on the narrative that I tried to construct, is what should we make of this 1738 review, which has been written shortly before the Institution, and where Du Châtelet seems to have quite a different position than in chapter 16 of the Foundations. And also, but this is probably more easy resolved and obvious, was the relationship between Du Châtelet and 18th century French Cartesianism à la Regnault. We have certain signs, if you want, of a Cartesian Du Châtelet. Du Châtelet reevaluates hypotheses in the physical inquiry, not in chapter 16, but as you know, in other places of the Foundations, which might be read by a very charitable, with the Cartesians reader, as a sign of affinity with this new Cartesianism. Also, the insistence of the mechanical reduction of attraction is a typical Cartesian theme. But on the other hand, the method of hypothesis of Du Châtelet is not, strictly speaking, Cartesian, at least as I see it, as she interprets hypothesis, the method of hypothesis, as an interplay between the principle of sufficient reason and the empirical consequences, which can lead to the confirmation of rejection of hypothesis. And in this sense, she seems to diverge both from the Cartesian and the Newtonian traditions, at least in France at that time. The Cartesian account of gravitation, criticized in the 1738 review, does not comply with empirical evidence, for instance, and should thus be rejected, while the Newtonian one is not in agreement with the principle of sufficient reason, and in this sense, it is unacceptable or only partially acceptable. Also, I wonder, but this is maybe just a matter of terms and not of concepts, but you will judge. I wonder if there is a difference between Du Châtelet's hypothesis and the conjectures of the conjecturalism of Regnault and the other Cartesians. Du Châtelet would perhaps say that these Cartesians admit too many hypotheses or too many conjectures or go too far. One might also add that she does not reject the possibility of certainty in physics, while Regnault seemed to reject the possibility of an ultimate certainty in physics. But I do not aim to settle these questions. I just wanted to maybe give some points for discussion, or to have your suggestions and understand something more from you. So I gladly leave these issues to our discussion, and thank you very much for your attention.